As a religion teacher, it has always irked me that whenever people do anything nice for a stranger, they're given the label a good Samaritan. Being nice to strangers is nice and all, and is certainly the call of Christ, but that really wasn't what Jesus intended when he told the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10.
It's important to recognize that all biblical parables had some type of shock value that was intended to get the audience to rethink some preconceived notion about cultural norms or even religious salvation. During the time of Jesus, to a Jewish audience's mindset, there could never be such a thing as a good Samaritan. They were sinners, they were evil, they were damned. Certainly, by no means could they ever be considered good. Yet in Luke 10, when Jesus tells the lawyer to go be like the Samaritan who helped the person in distress, the reader would have been shocked by such a mandate, considering that the two other men who walked by in the parable were a priest and a temple assistant known as a Levite.
Why were the Samaritans so despised during Jesus' time? Well, it actually goes back to the period of the divided kingdom of Israel.
In the 9th century BC, a civil war broke out between the descendants of Abraham, resulting in two separate kingdoms, Judah in the south and Israel in the north. The capital of Judah, Jerusalem. The capital of Israel, Samaria. The Jews of the southern kingdom continue to worship God in the temple located in Jerusalem, while the inhabitants of the northern kingdom chose to build shrines to Yahweh on mountaintops. In 722 BC, Assyria conquered the northern kingdom, and its inhabitants intermarried their captors, losing their devotion to Yahweh. In 600 BC, Babylonia conquered the entire region, including the southern kingdom, exiled the Jews, and destroyed the temple in the process. About 70 years later, after the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, the people of God were permitted to return home and rebuild their temple. Having a change of heart over the years, the inhabitants of the former northern kingdom of Israel, now known as the Samaritans, wanted to help the Jews of the former Judah to rebuild the Jerusalem temple. But soon they were met with opposition from the very people they wished to help. Essentially, the Jewish people's argument was this: you Samaritans were once people of God, but since you apostatize, that is, abandon your faith in Yahweh to engage in Assyrian idol worship, you are not worthy to rebuild Yahweh's temple. So we'll go at it alone. So, rather than taking their rejection lying down, the Samaritans unfortunately choose to retaliate by interfering with the temple rebuilding efforts by vandalizing and looting the sacred site over the next couple of centuries. So this is the reason for the contention and the religious racism we get 500 years later during the time of Christ.
I bring up this biblical history account because of this woman that was fired down in Texas.
Carmen Hicks, a Navy combat veteran, donated $500 worth of food to the church's food bank and took a week off of work so she could assist the community. After 3 days of volunteering, she was called into the church pastor's office and was asked to leave and not return, primarily because she was Jewish and a married lesbian. I'll include the link to the full article below.
So this article got me thinking, are LGBTQ people the modern day Samaritans?
Now let's look at some similarities. Both communities are born into a situation beyond their control. Both communities have been branded for centuries by religious authorities as sinners. Religious groups at the time want nothing to do with them, and both communities dealt with exclusion from their houses of worship.
Now, I'll be the first to admit this is not actually a perfect analogy, in that the Samaritans actually were indeed sinners. At one point in history, their Israelite ancestors did abandon Yahweh to worship the Assyrian deities. Now, if you're a follower of my series, you know my biblical, historical, and theological arguments that say that there is nothing wrong, there is nothing sinful about being LGBTQ members.
But nevertheless, with these similarities in mind, can Scripture provide us with any hope? In John chapter 4, we have a story about Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman at the well. And once she recognizes Jesus' religious authority, she immediately questions him about places of worship and asks him whether or not it's acceptable to worship on a mountaintop and not in the Jerusalem temple, since her community has been banned. Jesus responds by telling her that a time is coming that God won't care if it's on a mountain or in a temple. He says that the Spirit of truth guides those true followers to truth.
So let that sink in for one moment. God does not care where we worship, particularly if we've been rejected from our houses of worship. He only cares that we walk in truth, by the Spirit of truth. So what's the opposite of that? Not walking in sin, not walking in falsehoods, not hiding who you are, or staying in the closet?
Furthermore, in the aforementioned Luke chapter 10, Jesus actually tells his audience that the charity of a Samaritan can be stronger than that of the representatives of his Father's house. Given the characters involved, Jesus says to be like the Samaritan rather than the people running the church. Or in this Texas situation, be like the Jewish lesbian, not the Christian pastor.
Okay, well, time and time again, Jesus used parables in the Gospels to challenge society, to turn social conventions up on its head. Religious authorities were no exception to Jesus' rhetoric. I sincerely do fear that Christian leadership today has gone the path of what Jesus was most vocally against during the time of his ministry. If you've been following any of the headlines on James Martin's book, Building a Bridge with the Catholic Church and LGBTQ community, you can see all the social backlash from Catholic conservatives that a priest is willing to build a bridge, to open dialogue with LGBT people. Whereas that's really what Jesus was doing. Jesus was constantly trying to build bridges and invite the social outcasts, the ones that society labeled as the sinner, the damned, to the table. Father Martin is being Christ on this earth, which brings me back to my original point. Are we, the LGBTQ people, the Samaritans of the 21st century? If we are, we need to take some solace in the fact that in Luke chapter 10, Jesus tells the lawyer, go be like the Samaritan and not the religious authorities.